Shavua Tov, a good vach. How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you on a Saturday night and learning. We're not playing music during the opening 2 minutes because we're in the 9 days. Counting down, next Saturday is Tisha B'Av. So the fast of Tisha B'Av will be a week starting Saturday night, next Saturday night, and fasting on Sunday, a week from tomorrow. But it's a tradition not to listen to music during this time, the 9 days, commemorating that run up to the saddest day in the Hebrew calendar. How's everybody doing? Great to be with you tonight. A Shavua Tov from Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck. It's almost 1 a.m. I'm so impressed with the East Coast people who are tuning in on a Saturday night. Louis, Shavua Tov from Karen in Northern California, Ruth in Kentucky, Lindsay in Cincinnati. Welcome all of you. It's great to be with you. Let's get right into it. We always want to be efficient on a Saturday night, especially this time of year when it's so late. Did I forget to light the candle yesterday on the Friday show? This bell has been dull lately. Let's light up the darkness. All right. Here we go. Okay, so where are we holding? Today's page is 24, Chaf Dalet, here in the 15th volume of the Talmud Tractate Kesubos, generally the laws of marriage contracts. We are in chapter 2, tonight covering Mishna number 6. Marriage contracts need to be witnessed like all contracts, and we've been talking quite a bit about the presumptions that we can make when somebody appears, let's say, to testify about a contract that was written, but the contract itself is not present. So whose testimony do we believe and whose testimony do we not? What are the kinds of presumptions about a person or a situation which can create credibility or which can discredit a person's testimony? We pick this up, Mishnah number 6 at the bottom of page 23b. And likewise, with regard to two men whose lineage is unknown, and this man says, I am a priest, and that man says, I am a priest, they are not deemed credible. Right, so we've been generally speaking about this principle of the mouth that prohibits is the mouth that permits. And so we've had a string of Mishnahs in which people sort of reveal something about themselves that it was unnecessary to reveal, which is kind of negative about them, and that actually enhances their credibility. And then we believe them when they say something positive about themselves. Here in this Mishnah, we're talking about two men who come and say about themselves, I am a priest. So there's no other evidence that they're a priest. So are we going to believe this person or not? So here it says, two men whose lineage is unknown, and this one says, I am a priest, and that one says, I am a priest. They are not deemed credible. But when this man testifies about that man that he is a priest, and that man about this man, they are deemed credible. When one says about the other that guy's a priest, we believe him. So Rav Yehuda says one does not elevate a man to priesthood on the basis of a single witness. Now you might ask, well, if I say I'm a priest and he says I'm a priest, aren't we two witnesses? But maybe I don't count for myself, and only the one person has said about a third party that he is a priest. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, not enough. One does not elevate a man to priesthood on the basis of one witness. Two witnesses are required for that purpose. Rabbi Lazar says, when is that ruling? In a case when there are challengers to this claim, his claim that he is a priest, then you need two witnesses. However, in a case where there are no challengers, one elevates a man to priesthood on the basis of one witness. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, the son of the deputy high priest, one elevates a man to priesthood on the basis of one witness. Rabbi Shimon, the son of the high deputy, was a Cohen in the Second Temple period, the late Second Temple period, there at the time of the destruction. And because he came from a family that was not only a priestly family, but that his father was the deputy high priest, his knowledge both as a sage and as a highly ranking Cohen, was considered very, informative, if not dispositive, about priestly matters. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, why do I need all these different cases cited in the Mishnayos of this chapter? Right, a woman who says she's divorced and that she was married and then she's divorced, whether we believe her. A woman who says she was betrothed and then not betrothed. A woman who says she was held captive but she was not defiled. We have all these different cases that seem quite similar. Aren't they establishing the same principle over and over? Aren't they all based on the principle, the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted? And the Gemara answers, these cases are all necessary, as if the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnah, had taught only the case where Rabbi Yehoshua concedes, meaning a case where one says to another, this field, which is currently in my possession, belonged to your father, and I purchased it from him. Right? This is the mouth that prohibits. Right now, it's in his possession. No one has any reason to doubt that that field is his. When he says, but it used to belong to your father, but I purchased it. Right? So when he says it used to belong to your father, now he has created a situation where it's a possibility that, well, if it used to belong to my father, maybe it still belongs to my father. And then he says, but I purchased it. So the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permits it to him. So we believe him when he says that it's his, because he didn't have to tell us that it used to belong to someone else. So Rabbi, in that case in which Rabbi Yehoshua concedes, a case where one says to another, this field, which is currently in my possession, belonged to your father, and I purchased it from him, then one might have thought that his claim is deemed credible due to the fact that there is financial significance in his contention that it belonged to the other's father, and he would not have made that claim if it were not true. However, in the other case of witnesses authenticating their signatures on a document, like a marriage contract or a promissory note, where there is no financial significance for them as witnesses in their testimony, say no, their claim is not accepted. And if the Tana taught only the case of witnesses to a document, one might have thought that their claim is deemed credible due to the fact that their testimony is relevant to others. However, with regard to him, whose testimony is relevant only to himself, as he claims that he purchased the field from the other's father, say no, that his claim is not accepted. And if the Tana taught us these two cases, one might have thought, and now we're on 24a, one might have thought that the claim is deemed credible due to the fact that the cases involve monetary matters. However, in the case of a married woman who claims that she was divorced, which is a ritual matter, say no, she is not deemed credible. Therefore, it was necessary for the Tana to teach us all these three cases. And the Gemara asks, with regard to the case where one says, I was taken captive and I am pure, why do I need the Tana to teach that case? There is no novel element in that ruling, as it is merely another application of the same principle. The mouth that prohibits is the mouth that permits. And the Gemara answers, the Tana taught that case due to the fact that the Tana sought to teach based on it, and if witnesses came after she married, this woman need not leave her husband. The difference between an ab initio ruling, we have a case of uncertainty, she may not remarry yet till we have more evidence, but she went ahead and married anyway, then we don't force her to undo her current status of a married woman and leave her husband because there was uncertainty about whether she was free to marry or not. We don't force her to leave the marriage, and the Tana wanted to teach that principle. So the Gemara asks, this works out well according to the one who teaches the law in reference to the latter clause of the Mishnah with regard to a woman taken captive. However, according to the one who taught this law in reference to the first clause of that earlier Mishnah that we learned, with regard to a woman who claimed that she was married and divorced, what is there to say? According to that opinion, the ruling with regard to a woman taken captive who claims that she remained pure is superfluous. If a woman is deemed credible in the case where the concern is that she is a married woman, she is all the more so deemed credible when the concern pertains to a less severe prohibition, that of a woman who was violated in captivity marrying a priest. The only one she's prohibited to is a priest. And the Gemara answers, the Tana taught the superfluous law that a woman claiming that she was taken captive and remained pure, that she is deemed credible as an introduction due to the fact that the Tana of the Mishna sought to subsequently teach the case of two women who were taken captive and whether we believe them about themselves or only about each other, which is similar to the Mishnah we're studying now about whether we believe a man about himself that he's a priest. No, but we do believe him when he says about another man that he's a priest. And the Gemara asks, and why do I need the Tana to teach the case of two women who were taken captive? What novel element is introduced in that case that did not exist in the case of one woman? And the Gemara answers, lest you say, let us be concerned for collusion between the women, that each would testify for the benefit of the other. Now that they know that we don't believe them about themselves, but we do believe them when they testify about another, that we were both held captive, and she remained pure, and we're going to believe that. So maybe the two of them got together before they gave testimony and said, let's testify about each other, because in that situation we are believed. So maybe they colluded to create that situation or create that testimony because they knew they would be more credible that way. Therefore, the Tana teaches us that this is not a concern. We didn't talk about collusion in the case of two women who were taken captive, testifying about each other that they remained pure. There was no discussion of collusion. And so the Gemara asks, and why do I need the Tana to teach the following case? And likewise, two men, each testifying that the other is a priest. He already taught that if two women each testify that the other is pure, they are deemed credible. What new thing are we learning about these two men who say that each other is a priest, and then we would believe them? And the Gemara answers, the Tana taught the superfluous law with regard to two men as an introduction due to the fact that he sought to subsequently teach the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis concerning whether or not the testimony of a single witness is deemed credible to establish another's presumptive status as a priest. We didn't have that set of disputes between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis with respect to the Mishnah about two women who were taken captive and they testify about each other that they remained pure. They didn't have this dispute. Why is it coming up now in the case of two men who are testifying that each other is a priest? It must be something particular to the laws of the priesthood. So let's get into that. The Gemara elaborates. The rabbis taught in the Baraisa, in the case of two men, each of whom says, I am a priest and my counterpart is a priest, each is deemed credible with regard to enabling his counterpart to partake of teruma. Recall that teruma is the very first tithe that a farmer or other people creating produce is going to take, right? So you grow a field full of wheat, and once you harvest it, the initial 2% of your produce has to be given to a priest. That's called teruma. It's food consecrated for the use of priests only. Only priests can eat teruma. So when he says, I am a priest and my counterpart is a priest, each is deemed credible with regard to enabling his counterpart to partake of teruma. But he is not deemed credible with regard to establishing his presumptive status as a priest of unflawed lineage. Unflawed lineage means he is a priest. He's the son of a priest. His father was a priest. And not just that you're a priest because your father was a priest and your grandfather was a priest, but also that none of your, patriarchal ancestors disqualified themselves by, for instance, marrying a woman who's a divorcee. A priest is not allowed to do that. And if he does, then the children of that union, the male son of that union is called a halal, meaning a disqualified priest. He's a priest, but he's not allowed to serve in the temple. So the fact that he says, that I am a priest, or more importantly, that my partner here is a priest, it is enough for that counterpart to eat teruma, but not enough to create a presumptive status of unflawed lineage as a priest. For the purpose of a presumptive status as a priest of unflawed lineage, for the purpose of that other one marrying a woman, until there are three people, the two claiming to be priests and an additional witness, so that there are two witnesses testifying with regard to the status of this person and 2 witnesses testifying with regard to the status of that person. So evidently, we don't count testimony about himself at all. The only reason we're going to allow this guy to have a presumptive status of a priest of unflawed lineage is because his partner, the other priest, says he's a priest of unflawed lineage, and a third person comes along, so that with respect to each of these priests whose lineage is in question, there are 2 witnesses testifying about each of them, the partner and the newcomer witness, and we establish it that way, and their own testimony doesn't count at all. So the Gemara asks, is that to say that Rabbi Yehuda is concerned for collusion between them? And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda are not concerned for collusion. But didn't we learn that they said the opposite? As we learned in a Mishna about a totally different case where Rabbi Yehuda expresses a concern for collusion. In that Mishna, it was a case where donkey drivers entered a city, and one of them said, my produce is from this year's crop, and it is not yet completely dry, and therefore it is of lower quality. And the produce of my counterpart is old and dry, and therefore more durable. Or if he said, my produce is not tithed, and the produce of my counterpart is tithed, he is not deemed credible, right? So 2 guys arrive in the city selling stuff, and one of them says, listen, my stuff is no good. It's not tithed, or if it's a lesser quality, or it's too new. But my counterpart, my competitor, his produce has been tithed, or it is of sufficient quality. It is matured enough that it's ready to eat. So you would think that, his credibility should be great. He's admitting about his own produce that it's no good, but about his friend's produce or about his competitor's produce, he's acknowledging that it is good. You would think that this guy is deemed credible. And Rabbi Yehuda says he is deemed credible, but the majority, the rabbis, say he's not deemed credible. Why would the rabbis say that he's not deemed credible when he's putting down his own produce and saying his competitors is valid? It must be because we're concerned that these 2 guys are colluding. And it brings to mind that old joke, right, about the 2 beggars at the Vatican, right? So a priest is walking out of the Vatican, a Catholic priest, and he sees 2 beggars sitting right outside the Vatican, and one of them has a big Magen David, a 6-pointed Jewish star on a chain around his neck and a cup in front of him, and he's got like 3 pennies in his cup. And right next to him is another beggar with a big, crucifix on his chest, and he's got a bowl in front of him, and it's overflowing with money. And so the Catholic priest walks up to the guy with the Jewish star on his chest and says to him, listen, I can't help but notice it's not going so well for you. Maybe you're begging in the wrong place, or maybe you might want to take that symbol of your faith and, tuck it inside your shirt while you're outside the Vatican begging. And the beggar with the Jewish star elbows his neighbor and says, hey, Moshe, look who's trying to teach us about marketing. That's high up on my list of the series of jokes I'm doing, the 72 greatest Jewish jokes of all time. But at any rate, that's exactly the concern that they're talking about here. That these 2 guys might be colluding to create a situation where the one, whose produce has been vouched for by the one whose produce is admittedly no good, they're actually working together. So Rav Ada bar Ahava said that Rav said the attribution of the opinions is reversed in one of the Mishnayos, so that the opinions of the Tanaim are consistent in both the case of the priests and the case of the donkey drivers. Meaning, actually, it's Rabbi Yehuda who's concerned for collusion, and the rabbis are not. And somehow the Mishnah got corrupted in its transmission of the oral law. Abaye said, no, there's no problem with the Mishnahs. We see them correctly. Do not reverse the attributions. And the fact that Rabbi Yehuda accepts the claim of the donkey driver is because with regard to doubtfully tithed produce, right, there were 2 cases of the donkey driver, either that the produce is doubtfully tithed or that it is not sufficiently aged for it to be ready to eat. But in the case of whether it's tithed properly, right, whether the people who are selling it actually tithed it before they came to sell it, With regard to doubtfully tied produce, which is known as demai, the sages were lenient because most Amei Haaretz tithe their produce, right? So there are laws about doubtfully tithed produce, demai, where you're buying it from somebody that you can't be sure he's a pious enough person that he tithed it. So then you're going to have to tithe it yourself. But in terms of do we suspect these people of collusion or not, the bottom line is most people in ancient Israel, even if they weren't very pious, would tithe. You just couldn't be 100% sure that they tithe, but the majority of even the unpious people did tithe it properly. And so that's why the sages were lenient with regard to whether we suspect these donkey drivers of collusion or not. And Rav has said, is that to say that the contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yehuda and another statement of Rabbi Yehuda is difficult, but the contradiction between one statement of the rabbis and the other statement of the rabbis is not difficult? We're saying that the rabbis don't suspect the people claiming to be priests of collusion, but they do suspect the donkey drivers of collusion. Why do the rabbis have, this inconsistent view? Clearly, the contradiction between the rulings of the rabbis in these respective Mishnayos is difficult. So rather, the contradiction between the statement of Rabbi Yehuda and another statement of Rabbi Yehuda is not difficult, as we explained above, that Rabbi Yehuda was lenient with regard to doubtfully tied produce. And the contradiction between one statement of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and the other statement of the rabbis is also not difficult. Why? Fundamentally, the rabbis are not concerned about collusion between the two parties. However, in the case of the donkey drivers, the rabbis are concerned. They're not concerned about the men claiming to be priests or claiming that their partner is a priest, but they would be concerned about the donkey drivers. Why? As Rabbi Chama bar Ukva said in another context, that is referring to a case where one has the tools of his trade in his hand. Now we're on 24b. And here too, it is referring to a case where the second donkey driver comes with the tools of his trade in his hand, clearly indicating that he too came to sell his produce. Therefore, when the other driver praises his produce, there is room for concern that there was collusion and that in the next city their roles will be reversed. However, when there is no proof or no suggestion of collusion, then the rabbis were not concerned. It's not that they automatically jump to a presumption of collusion whenever two people are involved. It's that in the case of the donkey drivers, there was reason to suspect that there might be collusion because the one who says, well, my stuff is no good, but his you can buy. But the one who says, my stuff is no good, what's he doing there with produce that is apparently ready to sell, and then he says it's not ready to sell? It must be that these two guys are taking turns, depending on which town they're in, who says my produce is no good and the other guy's produce is good. The Gemara asks, and where is the solution of Rabbi Chama bar Ukva stated? It is stated concerning that which we learned in a Mishna, in Taharot 7:1, in the case of a potter who fashioned his vessels in ritual purity and abandoned his pots and descended to drink water from the river. And there is concern that in his absence, ritually impure people came into contact with his pots. And the inner pots are pure and the outer pots are impure. Right? So this question of what assumptions we can make about what happened when we weren't looking, as it were. So this potter who's making certain pots, and he wants them to remain in a state of ritual purity, so they shouldn't come into contact with a person who is ritually impure. So he needs to sort of be guarding his pots at all times. But during a certain part of the process, he went down to the river and didn't have his eye on his pots. Can we assume that his pots remained in a state of ritual purity? So the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, both these inner pots and those outer pots, right? The ones that people would touch if they only touched a few of his pots, and the ones that were sort of more inside the pile, that we can assume all of them are pure, or we can assume all of them are impure. Isn't it taught in a baraisa, both these inner pots and those outer pots are ritually impure? We cannot assume that any of them were not touched by some passerby who happened to be ritually impure. And Rabbi Chama bar Ukva said the baraisa is referring to a case where the tools of the potter's trade are in his hand, indicating that he intends to sell his pots. Since all potential buyers touch pots when examining them before purchase, the concern is that among those people there is one who is ritually impure. when he left his pot sitting there at his potting stand while he went to take a dip in the river. People would have walked by and examined his pots because they might have been, they looked like they were for sale. And we can't assume that any of those pots weren't handled by a passerby who might have been ritually impure. Now, it is a case of double uncertainty. Did someone come by at all? And if he came by, was he ritually impure? And you would think because of that double uncertainty, we shouldn't make an assumption that the pots are impure. But perhaps this is because we need a higher standard since we're talking about matters of ritual purity. Now, the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a different baraisa that both these inner pots and those outer pots are ritually pure? We don't assume that they became ritually impure. All of the pots are ritually pure. And Rabbi Hama Bar Ukva said the baraisa is referring to a case where the tools of the potter's trade are not in his hand, indicating that he does not intend to sell his pots. He didn't leave his pots on a table in a situation where passersby would think they're for sale. He just had them maybe on the edge of his backyard where he was working on them, and no one would walk by and think those pots are for sale. So there's no reason to assume that anyone touched his pots. And the Gemara asks, but if so, the ruling in the Mishna, the inner pots are pure and the outer pots are impure. So under what circumstance can this be found? When the tools of the potter's trade are in his hand, meaning it looks like they're for sale, all of the vessels are impure. And when the tools of the potter's trade are not in his hand, all the vessels are pure. So when do you find a situation that the outer vessels are impure and the inner are pure? So the Gemara answers, the Tana of the Mishnah is referring to a case where the tools of the potter's trade are not in his hand. However, he leaves his pots adjacent to the public domain and in an area demarcated from the public domain due to the stakes or other objects that are placed on the sides of the public domain to distance passersby from the walls of the private domain. And due to crowding, people will be pushed to the sides and inadvertently render the outer pots impure. Not that they're handling them, but they're left in a situation where people might simply come into contact with them because they're too close to a public thoroughfare where it gets crowded. So they do not pass close to the inner pots and will not touch the pots to examine them because they are not for sale. The Gemara proceeds to cite an additional resolution to the contradiction between the opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis with regard to collusion in terms of the presumptive status of priests and in terms of produce merchants. And if you wish, say instead that the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis in the matter of presumptive priestly status is unrelated to collusion. It's not that we're concerned that they're going to lie, to get together and lie. Listen, I'll say that you're a priest and you say that I'm a priest and they'll believe us. Rather, it is with regard to whether one elevates one who eats teruma to the presumptive status of priesthood for the purpose of lineage that they disagree. If you see, in ancient Israel when they were eating teruma, if you see someone eating food that is clearly known to be teruma, so can you assume that that person is a priest? So much so that you would now arrange a marriage for him based on the fact that he's a priest? Do we elevate to a presumptive status of priesthood based on the fact that we saw him eating teruma? There's a disagreement. Rabbi Yehuda holds that one elevates from teruma to lineage and therefore requires full-fledged testimony by two witnesses to enable the person to partake of teruma. Rabbi Yehuda would say, since if anyone sees him eating teruma, they're going to assume he's a full-fledged priest, before we let him eat teruma, we need testimony from two witnesses to establish that he is a priest. And the rabbis maintain that one does not elevate from teruma to lineage, and each matter is considered separately. So for the purpose of partaking of teruma, any testimony is sufficient. For the purpose of lineage, full-fledged testimony by two witnesses is required. A dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the law with regard to elevating from documents indicating that one is a priest to priestly lineage, right? So what allows us to assume that a man who we don't know whether he's a priest or not, and we witness something about him, what is going to enable us to assume that, yes, this guy's a priest? One proposition so far, is we see him eating teruma. If he wasn't a priest, he wouldn't eat teruma. He ate the teruma, so we must assume that he's a priest, and we allow women to marry him based on the status that he's a priest. But others would say, well, maybe, he's willing to eat teruma even though he's not a priest. Maybe he's just hungry, and we can't make that assumption, so we don't elevate to lineage from teruma. Now, we're asking, what about elevating from documents? What does this mean? So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If you say that it is written in a document, I, so-and-so, a priest, signed as a witness, in that case, who is testifying about him that he is a priest? He is the only source asserting that his priesthood, right? If we see in a document that somebody signed it, I, so-and-so priest, witnessed that this transaction took place. Well, the only one attesting to the fact that he's a priest is himself. The document doesn't testify to whether or not he's a priest, because the document was just all about a transaction that this man happened to witness. So we haven't got the testimony of two witnesses to show that this one is a priest. So the Gemara answers, no, this law is necessary in a case where it is written in the document, I, so-and-so, a priest, borrowed 100 dinars from so-and-so, and a witness signed the document. So what is the law there? Okay, now it's a little bit different. It's not that the one who claims to be a priest is acting as a witness in somebody else's transaction. Now the one who claims to be a priest is the one in the transaction. Let's say he's the borrower. So he signed as the borrower, so-and-so, the priest. Now, does that document testify to the fact that this guy is a priest? Can we elevate him to the priesthood, give him presumptive status of being a priest, based on the fact that when he entered into a transaction, he signed that document calling himself a priest, and the witnesses of the loan signed the document? In other words, can we assume that the witnesses not only witnessed the loan, but also said, yes, and I know that this guy's a priest, and so now that his name and description of a priest is in a loan document, that from that we can assume that it's true that he's a priest? Do the witnesses testify only concerning the loan of 100 dinars in the document, or perhaps they testify concerning the entire matter and thus confirm with their signatures that every detail written in the document is true, including the fact that the borrower is a priest? So with regard to the halakhic ruling, there is a dispute between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. One said one elevates to priesthood, to priestly lineage from such documents, and the other one said one does not elevate. So a dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the law with regard to elevating? So we didn't come to a conclusive answer whether we elevate from documents or not. Now we go on to a different question of elevating one to priesthood. A dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the law with regard to elevating from the lifting of hands for the priestly benediction to priestly lineage? Is the presumptive status of a person who recites the priestly benediction in the synagogue that of a priest in terms of lineage as well? I was just in Israel for the last 2 weeks. I came back last Monday with COVID, but thank God it's been such a light case. But while I was there, one big difference between Israel and outside of Israel is that in Israel, they duchen every day, right? They do the priestly blessing, meaning that in morning services, during the in morning services, and it's certainly on Shabbos, they call up the Kohanim that are in the congregation and stand in front of the room, and they say, to the congregation, may the Lord bless you and keep you, may the Lord countenance you and be gracious to you, may the Lord favor you and grant you peace. Who can do that? Only a Kohen. So if a man goes to the front of the room and blesses the congregation, can we assume that that is a Kohen, that is a priest, is a person of unflawed priestly lineage, and we can arrange a marriage for him based on the assumption that he's a priest? And the only thing we know about him is that he blesses the congregation. He stands in front. Do we elevate from the fact that he blesses the congregation? And the Gemara notes, raise the dilemma according to the one who said one elevates from teruma to lineage, and raise the dilemma according to the one who said one does not elevate from teruma to lineage. Okay, how are we connecting this to whether we make an assumption about one who eats teruma or not? So the Gemara notes, raise the dilemma according to the one who said one elevates from teruma to lineage. In his opinion, perhaps this applies only to teruma, where a non-priest who partakes of teruma performs a transgression whose punishment is death at the hand of heaven. Only a priest can eat teruma. If a non-priest eats teruma, he's risking his life. He might shorten his life through charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. However, with regard to the priestly benediction, where a non-priest who recites it violates a prohibition stated as a positive mitzvah, but no, the penalty is not charis, one cannot be certain that one would not recite the blessing if he were not a priest. Therefore, one does not elevate from the lifting of hands to priestly lineage. Or perhaps there is no difference, and in both cases, because there is a transgression involved, one can assume that a man would not risk performing a transgression were he not a priest. If he wasn't a priest, he wouldn't eat teruma. If he wasn't a priest, he wouldn't, be so impudent as to stand in front of the room and bless the congregation falsely. Now raise the dilemma according to the one who said, one does not elevate from teruma to lineage. In his opinion, perhaps this applies only to teruma, because it is eaten in private. Therefore, a non-priest might partake of teruma when he believes that no one is watching. However, with regard to the lifting of hands, which is recited in public, if one is not a priest, he would not be insolent to the extent that he would comport himself like a priest in public. Therefore, although partaking of teruma is not a clear indicator that he is a priest, reciting the priestly benediction is a clear indicator, or perhaps there is no difference, and due to the concern lest a non-priest partake of teruma in private and recite the priestly benediction in public, neither action can facilitate elevating the person to the presumptive status of a priest in terms of lineage. Now, there is a dispute with regard to the halachic ruling between Rav Chisda and Rabbi Avina. One said one elevates from the priestly benediction to lineage, and one said one does not elevate. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said to Rava, what is the law with regard to elevating from lifting of the hands to lineage? And Rava said to him, it's a dispute between Rav Chisda and Rav Avina. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak asked Rava, well, what is the law? And Rava said to him, I know and base the halachic ruling on a baraisa, as it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Yosei says, great is the legal authority of presumptive status, as one may rely upon it in determining halachic practice, as it is stated. Now we get a quote from the book of Ezra. Ezra is all about when they started to build the second temple after the 70-year Babylonian exile, and a bunch of people returned from Babylonia to the land of Israel and sort of really started over again. Building the Jewish nation in the land of Israel, rebuilding the temple, and reestablishing, bringing the sacrifices on the Temple Mount. The practice had lapsed for 70 years, so there were a lot of people that didn't know how to do it correctly, and they really had to sort of reestablish everything and figure out, and that included, so who is a priest? Who is qualified to bring the offerings and to eat of the offerings, the priestly portion? So we have a quote from Ezra chapter 2, verses 61 through 63. And of the children of the priests, the children of Habiah, and the children of Hakkoz, the children of Barzillai, who took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadite, and was called after their name. These sought their register of the genealogy, but it was not found. Therefore were they deemed tainted and put from the priesthood. And Tirshasa said unto them that they should not partake of the most sacred items until there stood up a priest with Urim V'Tumim. The Urim V'Tumim, right, was something that the high priest could consult in matters of national importance. It was sort of like a hotline to heaven. You could ask a question, and then the lights on the breastplate of the high priest would light in a certain order and spell out the answer from God. So they're saying we're not sure who's a priest with regard to members of that family, and until we get a prophetic confirmation that they are priests, we can't be sure that they are priests. So Rabbi Yosei explains, Nehemiah, the prophet Nehemiah, said to the priests whose status was uncertain, you maintain your presumptive status, right? They thought that they were priests, they just can't be sure. So he says, you maintain your presumptive status. Of what did you partake in the Babylonian exile? It was the consecrated items eaten in the outlying areas, meaning teruma. So here too, you may continue to partake of the consecrated items eaten in the outlying areas, meaning teruma, but you may not partake of offerings with regard to which you have no presumptive status of priesthood. So it's like they split the difference. If you're a priest, you should be able to eat both teruma and the priestly portions of offerings brought on the altar, like sin offerings. Part of that is eaten by a priest. So what Nehemiah said, look, while we were in the Babylonian exile, you guys assumed that you were priests, you were told that you were priests, and you were eating teruma. So you continue to eat teruma. Since there's now a doubt whether it's a certainty that you are priests, don't eat the priestly portions of sacrificial offerings, which are holiness of the highest order, but you can continue to eat teruma. And so the Gemara asks, and if it enters your mind to say that one elevates from the lifting of hands to lineage, so they will come to elevate those priests whose status was uncertain to priestly status in terms of lineage, since they lifted their hands and recited the priestly benediction while in exile. In other words, those who ate teruma also lifted their hands to bless the congregation, but we're now saying, but that's not good enough to eat the priestly portions, and presumably eating the priestly portions is equivalent to having unflawed lineage so that you can marry as a priest. And so lifting the hands, we shouldn't elevate from lifting the hands because that's equivalent to teruma, but we're seeing that there's a barrier where you have to have, established unflawed lineage in order to eat priestly portions and presumably to marry as a priest of unflawed lineage. I'm almost done. If you have any questions or comments, get them in. So the Gemara answers, here it is different. There was no concern lest they elevate them to lineage because their presumptive status was undermined by the fact that they did not partake of the offerings like the other priests. And if you do not say that one relies on the fact that their status was undermined, according to the one who said, one elevates from teruma to lineage, since they partake of teruma, there should be concern lest they come to elevate them to lineage. Rather, is the reason that this is not a concern not due to the fact that their presumptive status was undermined. It is clear to all that there is uncertainty with regard to their status as priests. However, one may not infer from the time of Nehemiah to a time when all priests eat teruma and recite the priestly benediction, and there is no factor that indicates that they are anything less than full-fledged priests. Perhaps then one elevates from teruma and from the lifting of hands to lineage. And that's where we're going to leave off the discussion at the very bottom of page 24b. We'll pick it up, God willing, tomorrow night at 6 p.m., the regular time, at the top of page 25a. Let me see if there are any questions or comments I can answer quickly. It's very late on a Saturday night. Sharon, will there be a daf next Saturday when it's Tisha B'Av? Great question. I got to think about that. Maybe not. Maybe not. Or maybe, yeah. I mean, maybe it's not so difficult to come. Oh, because there's no Torah study on Tisha B'Av, right? We don't engage in Torah study on Tisha B'Av other than reading Lamentations. So probably not. And then we're going to be coming out of a fast Sunday night. So let me think about that. But great question, and thank you for asking it. So that's it, everybody. Have a good night.